All right, looks like quite a few people are in the room. I know more people will be coming in as we're doing our introduction, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I'd like to start by introducing myself. My name is Jill McClary, and I am the Deputy Director and Acting Head for the University of Arizona Museum of Art. And it's my great privilege to welcome you to our program. Before we start, it is important to note that the University of Arizona sits on the homelands of Indigenous peoples who've stewarded this land since time immemorial, including the Tohono O'odham and Passamaquoddy, and we recognize the 22 nations of what is now called Arizona. Aligning with the university's core value of a diverse and inclusive community, it is our responsibility to recognize and acknowledge the people, the culture, and the history that make up the Wildcat community. And at the institutional level, we must be proactive in broadening awareness throughout campus and beyond to ensure that our students feel represented and valued. We are going to be having a really great discussion today. And, I do just want to acknowledge, I recognize that this topic may challenge some of you or may be asked you to consider new perspectives. And with that in mind, we do strive to create an environment that encourages reasoned discourse, intellectual honesty, openness to constructive change, and of course, respect for the rights of all individuals. So hitting these goals is a top priority for us today. So I want to thank you in advance for participating in a reflective, respectful, and thoughtful way so that we can have an environment that promotes those objectives. Finally, before I turn it over to Chelsea, I do want to thank everyone that makes these events possible, including our museum members. We have a great membership program, and it really is because of that program that we're able to do events like this one. I also want to thank the museum staff and volunteers, and of course, give a big thanks to our guests, Liz and Gloria. And again, thank you to all of you for joining us. We love having you here for this discussion. And I'm now going to turn it over to Chelsea Farrar, the museum's curator of community education or community outreach. Sorry, Chelsea, I know your title.
No problem. Thank you so much, Jill, for that fantastic welcome. And I would just like to say welcome to everyone as well. And I am also just really excited to have what I think will be just a really thoughtful, engaging, and inspiring conversation with these two brilliant educators and artists that are joining us tonight. A couple of points before we get started is that after our public talks, we always email out a survey to all of our attendees. And so I just want to point out that's something to look for in your email, whatever email you use to register for. We really appreciate anyone filling out, those attendees filling out that survey as the feedback. Feedback helps us understand kind of who's in the room, who's not in the room, who are we serving, and how can we serve our community better. So please keep a lookout for those surveys that will be coming to you after the talk is over. Also, we have quite a large group gathering us today for this talk, which is absolutely exciting. But as we know, bandwidth is not equitable across the country, across the world even. So one thing that helps everyone have a little bit better access and helps reduce bandwidth on their ends is if folks can turn off their cameras while the presenters are speaking. That would be super helpful. And then lastly, for accessibility, we do have closed captions available. If you don't see them being generated right now, on the bottom right hand of your Zoom window, you should see an option to turn on or turn off captions, or it might say turn on or turn off subtitles. And so if you would like those, go ahead and turn them off. If you do not want them, go ahead, or vice versa. All right, well, I think we should get started. Welcome again to what I hope will be just a fantastic talk. The title of why the Western Art European Canon doesn't serve students anymore and maybe never did, with Elizabeth Denneau and Dr. Gloria Wilson. So it is my pleasure to introduce them today. Elizabeth, there we go. Elizabeth Denneau is an artist and art educator residing in the Sonoran Southwest. She received her BFA in Art and Visual Culture Education and is currently a candidate at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago for her MFA in Art. In her artistic practice, she is continually influenced by narratives of human perseverance, vulnerability, hidden histories, and power dynamics. Denneau works in a number of mediums, which are often inspired by her time as a fashion designer. And in an attempt to connect with her ancestors, her current work is a series of sculptures that revolve around the unspoken, buried, and erased histories of the antebellum South and their reverberations throughout generations into modern culture. Denneau teaches contemporary art and culture at Marana High School in Tucson, Arizona, while working with local community organizers and colleges to develop practical models of social justice and art education. Her desire is that her students will be able to see themselves better represented in the art world and be inspired to pursue their own artistic journeys. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here. And also joining us is Dr. Gloria Wilson. Dr. Wilson is the co-founder and director of the Racial Justice Studio and assistant professor of art and visual culture education at the University of Arizona. Before returning to complete her PhD at the University of Georgia, Gloria taught visual art in secondary environments for 13 years. Her research is situated within the fields of cultural studies, Black studies, critical pedagogy, and women of color feminisms. An artist, public scholar, qualitative art-based methodologist, she has presented her research nationally and internationally, highlighting the intersections of race, identity, formations, and arts participation. Wilson's work analyzes the cultural systems which work to produce race and racism in general, and more specifically examines constructions of racial representations across creative modalities, and how these practices and processes work to reinscribe or refuse hegemonic systems. She facilitates recurring race-conscious art-based workshops for in-service teachers and the broader public at various art museums in North America. So obviously we have two absolutely amazing scholars, educators, artists to talk about this topic. And I am so excited to have you both here. So we're going to start with each presenter starting us off, and then we'll have some questions, conversations with myself, and then we'll have some time for a Q&A with everyone that is in the that's in the space. So that's what the chat is for. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. Liz, I hand it over to you.
Hi everyone. This is so cool. There's like so many people here. I see a lot of people I know too. So thanks. Shout out to the homies. That's cool. So I just want to start off with introducing myself a little bit more. And kind of explaining why I teach the way I teach before we get into like the nitty gritty, so you can kind of have a baseline of where I'm coming from. So I made a PowerPoint because I'm a K through 12 teacher and that's what we do. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, there's me, like a very long time ago, not that long. That was me during my student teaching. And what's really cute about this is the kids were learning about Kehinde Wiley, and it was right when he was doing his presidential portrait. And they told me that the portrait was being unveiled. And so we had a real discussion about why contemporary art matters. And just kind of fun talk about like the juxtaposition of previous portraits with Kehinde's portrait. So just a little reference on that. So just my street cred, why am I here? All right. So I have a BFA and ABCE, that's Art Visual Culture Education. I graduated from U of A. It's a really great program. I'm currently getting my MFA at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, getting that in 2023. I've been teaching certified for only 4 years now, but I've been teaching uncertified for over 10 years. And I also worked in child welfare for 10 years. So I worked in group homes. I set up programs, arts programs for primarily youth in crisis, foster care, those sort of things. I've done a lot of work with nonprofit art programs and developments. I worked with, for a very long time, with an all ages venue called Scrappy's in downtown Tucson. You might remember that, those of you who are local. I spent 5 years in early childhood development, and I am an Art 21 educator, which means I'm part of an institute of educators that are connected to the Art 21 films and educational elements. You're probably familiar with them if you're an art nerd like me, and I see some Art 21 folk in here. Hi, guys. And I'm a culturally responsive educator and consultant, so people will sometimes come to me and ask me for help and things like that. When it comes to culturally responsive teaching and anti-racist teaching. So I wanted to talk really quick about my artistic practice. As Chelsea said, a lot of my work is primarily research-based, and right now it's really manifesting as sculpture. But I wanted to give you kind of a reference, an idea of what my artwork looks like. My students are very familiar with my artwork. Sometimes I make it alongside of them. So I'm not going to get into the meeting too much, but you know that from Chelsea's introduction that I work in like historical narratives and research about right now the antebellum South, but usually it's about oppressed communities, underserved communities, hidden stories, hidden histories. So these are some of my pieces, my sculptural works. And I also do painting, not as much right now. I kind of am a multidisciplinary artist. So I kind of just go where the flow takes me. So more importantly for this talk, my educational art practice. This is one of my students viewing a Kehinde Wiley painting. So one of the reasons why I teach the way I do, the best way to explain it is to talk about the achievement gap and how knowledge is used in teaching. So essentially, I just made this little flow chart. This is kind of a known idea. I can't take credit for this. So you have a teacher and a student, and the teacher creates a mode for knowledge, right? So it's a lesson, it's a experimentation, it's something that they're doing to create knowledge for the student, right? And they encode it to reach the student through all different methods, right? And the student receives that knowledge, right? So the teacher is encoding it not only with academia and curricula, but they're also encoding it with like their own personal understanding, their bias, their experience, right? So then the student receives that knowledge and they have to decode it now, right? Because we don't all speak the same language mentally, visually, verbally, dialect, right? So the student receives that knowledge and now they have to decode it so they may understand. So when that student decodes it, they take it, they do whatever mode the teacher gives them, right? So they're doing the lesson, they're doing the project, and the student takes that knowledge and then encodes it, right? With the new understanding that they have about that knowledge. And with their own personal experiences, right? And their own frameworks, their own narratives, their own cultures, right? And then they give it back to the teacher, right? And the teacher takes that knowledge and encodes it again, decodes it again, using their understanding of the student and their own, again, personal experience, and of course, assessment strategies and curricula and that sort of thing. So the important thing there is that 79% of the teachers in the US are white. And 41% of the students in the US are white. These are statistics that are a little old, they're from 2017, right? But it's not a stretch of the imagination to say that. So if you have a teacher that is white, that is encoding and decoding for a student that is white, a teacher that is grew up in middle-class society, and a student that's growing up in middle-class society, it's not surprising that the people that are on the top of the achievement polls, the achievement statistics, are middle-class white students, right? The reason why it's important to think about this is because this encoding and decoding is really the mechanism of understanding. So if a teacher is encoding and decoding from not only their own curricula or academia, but their own biases, their own knowledge. If a student has similar experiences, biases, and knowledge, they're going to do better, right? So that's why all this stuff that we're talking about today, anti-racism, culturally responsive teaching through art is important because you can put this into the art education model easily, right? If I'm a teacher and I want to teach a student the importance of X, Y, and Z, it's going to make a bigger impact on them if I'm working from a contemporary art point than I am maybe a classical art point. Classical meaning Western European art. So hopefully that quick little breakdown kind of helps a little bit. So again, which artist empowers, challenges, and represents my students more? Is it Kehinde Wiley or is it, School of Athens? I can tell you what my students think, and I am going to tell you, but just take a look at these two pictures. Which one is more familiar to you? Which one's more intriguing? Okay. This is a piece that resulted off of one of Kehinde Wiley's, one of our investigations of his work. This is the piece that was created after an investigation of Patrick Martinez's work. The student really blossomed after this unit and found her voice. And actually has her work up in TMA, so you can go see it. This is off of a social justice protest poster unit we did with Shepard Ferry and Fabiana Rodriguez. Dress code is still a huge thing, so you know. So these are some of the things that my students have said. This is just what I'm going to end with in this introduction. Hopefully I didn't take too much time. But these are what my students said when we saw these works in the classroom. I use a lot of R21 films because I'm an R21 educator, but also I use a lot of different mediums to show this work. And if it's ever in town, I definitely take them to see it. So upon seeing Kara Walker's A Subtlety, one of my students said, "I see myself." I didn't know that art was more than paintings and sculptures after we looked at Alex DeCourt and Nick Cave. They come in with a knowledge of art that is very small. You could perpetuate that smallness if you stay in the Western canon. I didn't know I could make art about this. I understand better now. This is a unit on Chanupa Hanska Luger and the appropriation and use of stereotyping in Native cultures, towards Native cultures. Portraits are about, sorry, my thing, I can't read it completely this way. Here we go. Portraits are not about the artist, it's about seeing them. I'm sorry, I can't. There we go. Portraits are about the person in it and not the artist. It's about seeing them and making sure others do. So really talking about honoring portraits and not exploiting people in them. And how amazing is collage, Ms. Denneau? This is a Lorna Simpson piece that we looked at. I feel proud. This is Fabiana Rodriguez. It's changed the whole story. It's about flipping narratives with Gallagher. These are some of the narratives that they flipped. So hopefully that gives you kind of an idea of why I do what I do and why I use the methodology that I do, but we'll get more into it. So I thank you very much for that. Listening to me, chat away.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was really inspiring. I have a lot of questions for you. I want to just dig into like so much of that already. But we'll definitely come back to it. And if you have comments, questions for Liz, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we will get to them at the end as well. Awesome. Well, Dr. Wilson, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Okay, thank you so much. Liz and I have a lot in common in that I spent a lot of time teaching in secondary environments. I started my teaching career over 20 years ago in a middle school classroom in Mobile, Alabama, which is where my father is from. I am the daughter of a father who was in the Air Force, and we moved around a lot. My mother is from the Philippines, and she also has Chinese and Spanish DNA. And so I will say that my very earliest experiences trying to understand or untangle, the notion of race is when my family moved to the US after we had lived in the Philippines, and my dad was stationed in the Philippines. And my mother, I remember the experience of my mother doing my hair. I was about 7 at the time. And I write about this in my work also. She told me and my sister that we would probably have to fill out forms at school, and if we came across a question about our race, that we needed to check the box marked Black. And so as a 7-year-old who respected her mother and her mother's wisdom, didn't question that. However, in my mind, moving through life, getting older, moving through adolescence and middle school and high school, I began to have questions about what this actually meant. And I always felt like I would need to deny part of my own DNA and in fact deny my mother. And so I think that I come to these conversations and I come to teaching with the lens, and Liz talked a lot about how we come to bring knowledge into teaching and learning spaces, and how our students receive that knowledge. And when we enter any room, to know that we bring with us in those rooms a whole host of experiences. And when we talk about this notion of race, and we talk about racial identity, when we talk about notions of diversity as it relates to ethnicity, we come from a very particular position. And most times it doesn't necessarily happen because children who are born, with darker skin have this innate awareness of difference, so to speak. Oftentimes it comes through experiences that others impose on us. And we are made to feel othered, or we are made to feel different. And so as a teacher, coming into the room with the whole host of experiences that I had, starting at that pivotal moment when my mother was doing my hair, and insisting that, our identity was a very specific identity, which was on a school form. I bring that into the room with me when I'm thinking about who is in the room. And Liz, you mentioned who is in the room, and any of you who have ever taught in K-12 environments may have come through an educational program that taught you to know who's in the room and meet the students where they are. And so I've only taught in under-resourced environments. I've taught in 3 different public school settings. The very first setting that I taught in was an all-Black middle school in Alabama. And standardization and testing was very prominent at the time. I believe it still is. And so what happened, and the reason why I left that school is because the state decided that the test scores weren't high enough and that the arts needed to be taken away. And so I was then moved to a predominantly white rural high school. And my orientation needed to shift to meet those students where they were, to help them understand the broadness and the scope of what art could be. And so not only teaching, a practice-based approach, but also bringing in aspects of their lived and social conditions to help them understand and even connect with the art classroom. Any of you who have taught a foundations course in higher ed, or who've taught an Art 1 course, we know that lots of those students are placed in those courses not by choice. Perhaps the other electives are full. Maybe their first choice was music or theater. And so the question becomes, how do we connect with the students who are in the room? How do we have them make sense of why we are teaching and insisting that we teach 2-point perspective? And so when I think about what curriculum could be, and Liz, I believe you mentioned part of this, I think about the root of curriculum, which actually means to move. It's movement. And so when we think about knowledge, and when we think about us as educators and what we are moving through the space, what forms of knowledge that we're moving through the space, we have to question how that knowledge might make meaning in the lives of students. And so I go back to thinking about foundations courses and thinking about the Art 1 course, and thinking about the fact that many of those students will not, for a number of reasons, choose the arts as a profession to take up. And so then we go back to inquiry and questioning and asking ourselves, what knowledge are we bringing into the room? How is that connecting with our students so that they can find meaning in education in general? So many students are disengaged with their educational experiences because there are other pressing issues happening in their lives. They might be having to take care of siblings. They might be having to take care of themselves. They might be hungry, and these are not just students of color, these are also white students. And I know that for sure from teaching in the rural white school. And so I think what we have to return to is the ways that children question the world. And we have to return to when the moment that children, we were all children at some point, all of us in the room. We have to think about when we were shut down from our questioning of what is happening. I rely on that. I rely on questions, and particularly questions about what knowledges are privileged in the room. And just as Liz, sort of introduced us to what artists she brings into her curriculum to open up a discussion about what art can be, and thinking about how we are defining art in and of itself, where that definition comes from, and how it may limit our discussion about making real connections and real relationships with people. And I believe that any interest in having conversations around the notion of race, around racism, begins with a level of trust, and it begins with a level of being in relationship with other human beings, because I do not think that a productive conversation can happen between two people who don't trust each other. It just will not happen. And so I taught at the predominantly white school for 9 years. And I will say that I had more terrifying moments teaching in that environment than I did at the first school that I taught, that was predominantly Black, where students were bussed in from 3 different neighborhoods and they all had beef with one another. So there were fights every day. I was never harmed in any of those fights. But at the white school, I experienced, my wallet being stolen over and over. I experienced my windows being blown out, but I didn't leave, I stayed. And those students still stay in contact with me. And it only came over time that they understood that I truly wanted a relationship with them. And over time, they trusted me. And so, you know, again, as I said before, when we're talking about sensitive topics such as race and racism and systems of oppression, I have to start with the question of, you know, how are you in relationship to other people? How are you entering into the conversation? I think it's also important to think about where we enter the conversation. It's no surprise that our country, you know, has a over 400-year history of subjugation, of genocide, of removal of peoples from lands that they inhabited, you know, before it was named North America. There is no surprise that these lands needed to be resourced, you know, in order for folks to become wealthy, you know. And so when we think about where we enter this conversation, we can only enter at the point at which our knowledge base begins. And so, you know, there is no silver bullet to having these conversations. Oftentimes we come to them and we stumble, and that's okay. I think that it's a lifetime of work that we have to continue to do every day. And you know, there should be no shame in speaking up about what you don't know, really. And you know, when you enter into a space with someone who is willing to listen and willing to dialogue with you, then I encourage staying in that space and working through the discomfort.
Thank you so much, Gloria. That was so much wisdom and insight, and I really, really appreciate it. I think that one of the reasons that I invited you both to this conversation is because you each have such similar backgrounds and experiences in teaching, even though they were on two, you know, very different, you know, opposite parts of the country, right? And even with that, there's you know, a lot of similarities in your experience. One thing that I kind of wanted to point out that you brought up, Gloria, that I wanted to come back to you real quick, Liz, is, you know, the title of the talk that we came up with is, you know, why Western Art Canon isn't serving students. And it's specifically not, you know, saying like it's not serving white students or Black students or students of color. It's not serving students, right? Intentionally all students. And so do you mind speaking a little bit more, since you went into such depth about the response that your students are having to your curriculum, Liz, of the demographics that you have in your classroom? It's not everyone is from Tucson and may not be familiar with the area where you're teaching.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great question. So I work at Marana High School, which is a rural high school outside of Tucson, Arizona. We actually bus all the way to 3 Points to the reservation. It's a very large area. So our school, even though it's rural, tends to be a little bit more diverse than maybe some rural schools. Our student population is primarily white, but it has become more split down the middle. So half the population, almost half the population is white, and almost half the population is that of kids of color. So, and that the biggest part of that being Hispanic, Mexican, Latinx students. And there's an extreme class there. There's like students that are living in absolute poverty, right? And then there's students who are very well off, very affluent. So it's kind of an interesting mix because there's so many dynamics and so many like just on the opposite end going on there. So what Marana High School is seeing is an influx of students of color. It's getting larger. There's more people of color moving to Marana. And that population of white students is still prominent, but it's getting smaller or more balanced, I guess. So that's kind of what the high school looks like. And you wanted me to talk about using contemporary art in that fashion, right? With those students. Okay, sorry. I just want to make sure I'm answering all the questions. So first and foremost, contemporary art serves all students because it is contemporary. It's everything that they've seen. And also, a lot of these contemporary artists, they are familiar with, they don't know that they're familiar with them, right? They don't know that they're already engaging in this art. They don't know that it's even art, right? So they're already there. You just have to hook them, right? So part of our jobs as teachers is continually trying to find that hook, right? And so you have this kind of baseline with contemporary art where they already recognize these things, these symbols, this visual language, they are already a part of, right? The other piece is that when my students come in after being in 9th grade, I ask them, what artists do you know? It's always Picasso, Van Gogh, and Frida, which I do teach because, yeah, yay, Frida. And also, I think sometimes she's a little misunderstood. So they don't know. It's very 2D, right? And so when students find that art is film, art is dance, it's performance, it's collage, it's assemblage. When you introduce them into these mediums, suddenly they are an artist, right? They struggled through their middle school art class learning how to shade, but they are so bomb at collage. They know how to build something out of clay. I have a student who is beyond his years and he just sees things in abstract shapes in a way that I could never, right? However, if we are working just from the westernized canon, the Western European canon, and this hierarchy that's already been placed on them, right? They already know what the hierarchy of art is. It's just part of our culture because of colonization, because of white supremacy, because of all of these things, all of these things that are ingrained into our society, and we are now trying to disrupt as educators, right? So this is already what they think art is. It's why a lot of students don't take art in high school, right? And when a student says to me, well, I want to take art, but I'm not an artist. I can't draw. I'm not an artist. I was like, when you were 3 and you drew your dog with crayons and you took it to your mom, what did you say? Did you say, I'm not an artist? No, you said, Mom, hang this on the fridge, right? And Mom hung it on the fridge. What happened from when you were 3 to now that you're 14 that you think you are not an artist? It's because the Western European canon is so prominent, and this idea of like hyper realistic, figurative work featuring white people, right? They don't see themselves in it, and they don't think that they can do that, right? So that alone is one, well, that's not alone, but that is one of the major reasons to teach contemporary art. I know a lot of art educators are super scared of throwing out perspective. Right? Like, no, I gotta teach them the golden triangle. I have to, right? We're still skill-based, right? We're still producing things with our students. However, it's okay to let go of that, because also the golden triangle, ain't nobody using that right now. I mean, they are instinctually in a lot of ways, but like in contemporary works, if kids are like super art nerds, like some of my kids are, and some of them aren't, that's okay. That's even more better because they can discover their own medium. But like, if they want to be in the art world, right? The fine art, that's not what's happening right now. So we're doing them a disservice if we keep, and I know it's scary because you enter into these conversations that you're just like, whoa, I'm showing Kara Walker now, and my kids have questions, or I'm afraid of what questions they might have, and that's real. But nothing's gonna hook your kids like seeing, the miraculous sugar baby. Like, it's just blows them away every time. So hopefully that kind of answered this question.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. It made me think of just so many personal experiences as an art teacher in the classroom, and that experience of students saying, I'm not good at art. And when I get down to it, what they're actually saying is, I can't draw. And as you said, it's because that visual representation of Western art, that Western Art Canon has been so normalized into our American education system, is that they can make art, but we have to broaden their understanding of what art is. It's not just realistic drawing. My experience of the artist, when I asked them, what do they know? It was always the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That was the four that they could describe, right? So that's what they associate with what art is. And if they can't make it like that, then they're not artists. And so deconstructing that, breaking that down is so important. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on that, Liz. So a question that I have for you both, and I know there's quite a few comments and questions in the chat, so I want to try and save some time for some of those, is obviously, I mean, kind of the big question of what we're talking about here is changing our systems with a goal of removing racism from our teaching, from our classroom, from our interaction with students, even our interactions with our colleagues on a campus, whether that's K-12 or a college campus, right? So I think it's important, maybe you each can share a little bit about what does it mean to be an anti-racist art educator for each of you. And I think it's important that you each have a similar background, but Gloria, you're currently now teaching, in a college campus, so maybe you can also talk to that.
Sure. So I think that it's important, and I teach this in my classroom. I look at all humans as researchers. If you're curious about anything, it means that you are doing research. If you are asking questions, you are doing research. You're trying to tease through all of the things, and you're filtering certain things, and you're making connections, and you're interpreting, and that's always happening. And so often I begin with having students tease through their subjectivities. Who are you? Who are your people? Where do you come from? And students many times are scared to even, sort of articulate some very real realities, that they're, for instance, if we're talking about race or gender, that it is okay to, sort of name, the thing that has been ascribed to you. So whiteness as an identity marker, even though we know that this is, inherently a way to categorize people, that to reduce, a body to one label is both myopic, but it's also used as a strategy. And so we have to interrogate and name the thing that has been imposed on us. And so oftentimes students of color or people of color do this quite naturally, because we find ourselves in spaces and places where we are the only one, or we are one of few. So we are always familiar with, one of these things is not like the other type of concept. And so we have these conversations with our families because the world sort of speaks to us in that vocabulary. And so what that means is that whiteness, because it is the common narrative or the status quo, oftentimes white students will come to me and say, well, I don't really have that much that's interesting about me. I'm just white, And so then I have them think about, well, why is that happening? we come to these conversations with the notion of inquiry and wonder why certain parts of an identity are necessarily submerged and reduced. And so I think that, an anti-racist practice isn't only about having representation in a physical curriculum, but it's also self-reflective, and asking ourselves the question of who we are, what knowledges we bring into a space, what knowledges have we been denied knowing about, because I came through a very standard art education undergrad program. If you had asked me at the time to name Black artists of color, I don't think I could have done it. I don't think I could have done it, And so if you think about that, that is another way of sort of suppressing knowledge from students who enter into these spaces that have no knowledge of people that share a similar lineage, would love to have. It was such a profound experience for me to be in that Black middle school and have students name, much like Liz said, some famous artists, and they could name the canon. They can name the canon. And these were students who had not had art before. And so you have to think about the power in that. How in the world, in my mind, did these students miss the walls that were saturated with so much color in that classroom? I insisted those onto my wall. However, they missed what was right in front of them. And so if we think about the power of curriculum, curriculum is that which moves knowledge. It's not only what the teacher in the formalized classroom shares, but it is what we get through the media. It's what we get through film, right? Like, how many films can we name that have been about prolific artists? When we think about who the term genius sticks to and has never been applied to, I think of women. How many women can we name for which the term genius has been applied, much less people of color? And so when we think about the ubiquity of information and knowledge that we receive every single day beyond what's only in our textbooks, then we can begin to see how powerful these messages that humans receive about what art is, who is important, whose knowledges are important. And if we don't start with ourselves, and we don't start with what it is that we know and what it is that we don't know, and even who it is that we know and who we don't know, who do we have conversations with? When I think about people having conversations around trying to figure out whether or not, one is racist. And then they think about the one Black or brown person that they work with, But what I say is, whose family do you know? What ways of being are you familiar with? Every now and then, my Alabama accent will come out, and there was a time in my life that I was ashamed of that. Okay? And so when I think about an anti-racist practice, I think about, how are you letting your students show up in the room? I'll never forget, I was in grad school with a colleague who, happened to be a white woman, and she was a former middle school or high school teacher. And she talked about having the realization about one of her Black students who every single morning would come to her door, and her interpretation was that she was loud and she was always yelling. And then she came back to be in grad school, and she understood a little bit differently that her cultural norm was that she yelled at anybody that she cared about. And so she would come to the door and say, "Hey, miss, whatever, whatever." And she took offense to that, And so when I think about having an anti-racist practice, I think about in what ways are our biases limiting our students from approaching a marker of what we define as success? Are we allowing them to come into the room and be their whole selves? Accent and all, loudness and all, you know, hand movements and all, neck rolls and all. Like, I do all of those things, you know, and I have this thing called a PhD, you know, and so somebody saw something in me and encouraged me to keep doing it and to keep going. And so there were people along the way who allowed me to be myself, you know, to allow me to move through a system that wasn't necessarily designed for folks quite like me. And so, you know, it goes beyond what we consider, you know, the curriculum that we write. I think the world is a curriculum that teaches us something. This is knowledge in motion. And what are we doing to interrupt those knowledges that are dominant, those knowledges that insist their ways into history books, that insist their ways into this canon?
Yeah, that is so inspiring. That question of, you know, how do you let your students show up in your room, I think is a question that every teacher should be writing down and reflecting on every single day. I you know, something not the same, but it definitely is, you know, sparked a reminder of my experience of as a pre-service educator, as a queer woman, I identify queer woman, you know, asking my teachers in college of, you know, how is this going to work? What is this going to look like of being, you know, a queer woman in a classroom wanting to teach art and being myself? And the teacher's response was, well, you know, teachers don't talk about their sexuality in class. And I just was like, well, you just don't even realize the photographs of your family that you have on your desk, right? That is a visual indicator of who you are and who you're allowed to be in your classroom, right? And so these things just get normalized, and it's so important to reflect on them and give people space to be who they are. And you never know what door you're closing on someone any day. Liz, how about for you? What is in your practice, what does it mean to be an anti-racist art educator?
So, I mean, Gloria hit all the notes, but I can only add to that, right? Because I agree with all of that. It's what I do too. I think that's why Gloria and I are so similar, and definitely worked in similar environments. The environment I work in is the community is very conservative, you know, and there's a lot of things that are problematic there in every community, though, really. But it's important for me to be there teaching the way I do, using anti-racism. But anti-racism is, I can't say enough, we're reframing education. So kids that are Black and brown, kids of color, queer kids, can see their humanity, right? So think back to high school. Do you remember calculus? Do you remember any of that? I don't. I seriously don't. And your kids will remember you, though, and how you made them feel. And they will also remember the people that put them down and made them feel like crap, right? Those are the things you remember. You remember the kids that put you down, and you remember your homies, right? You remember that. You remember the good times, and you remember that humiliation, whether it came from a teacher or another kid. So at base, if you're reframing education, yes, you have to, all of the things. You have to dig into pedagogy. You've got to decenter whiteness, but you have to build those relationships, like Gloria was saying. You cannot teach this stuff unless you know your students. I cannot say that enough. If you don't know your students, and that was hard this year, teachers in the room, shout out, that was hard, right? We were online, we're still online, some of us, right? And so building those relationships, especially because the art room becomes this like safe space right? Where kids can be vulnerable for the first time in the school day. It's their sanctuary. If you do this, if you get to know them, and if you show that you're interested in them, and that you are speaking their language, you're trying to communicate, you don't have to be perfect at all. But building those relationships, my students last year, I could tell you about every single last one of them, like every one of them. And you can't teach anti-racism in a classroom if your students don't trust you, right? And I've been in other classrooms, and it comes up in my classroom. Why are we looking at all this Black stuff? Right. That's one that myself and my colleagues hear. Sometimes it's not happened often in my room, but sometimes when somebody's new, they don't know Ms. D and what she does, right? And my response is, what is Black stuff? Well, I don't know, like all this. Well, what is it? They can't really tell you, because then they have to examine what Black stuff is. And they'll say, what's white stuff? Is that what you want to learn? Right? So digging, asking them questions, challenging them, right? And you don't have to say anything but, what is this? Why is this? Who is telling you this? Why are they telling you this? These are the tenets of contemporary art and art and visual culture education. So like, really, you just have to be willing to make that relationship, and then push them a little bit, challenge them a little bit, but also make sure they know about their successes. A teacher that lifts you up, especially when you're making things about your messed up home life and you're collaging it and your heart and soul's out there and you're feeling some kind of way, and your teacher is like, man, are you proud of yourself? I'm proud of you. Do you see this? Do you know how sophisticated this is? I love using words like that because they're like sophisticated. So yeah, just, you have to build those relationships, and you can't just be like, oh, I'm an anti-racist teacher. It needs to be a practice in your own life, which Gloria also said. If you are not hanging around or getting to know queer people, and guarantee you have queer kids in your classroom, even if they're not talking about it because they don't feel safe, you will have gaps in that connection. You will not reach them as well as you will if you have to. It's a full change in your life. And it is for me too, all the time, right? I'm not perfect. I catch myself. I have my own biases, right? Being aware of your biases and knowing that there are you have your own set of criteria of what is white and what is Black and and you constantly have to disrupt that. It is a lifestyle. It is not just a teaching methodology. It's not a strategy, right? It's a lifestyle that will result in massive change if you do it, right? And it also is hard. I work with a lot of colleagues that don't see any of this. They think, they see that the kids are really into art, that my program is growing, but the work that I do is either too scary or unimportant to them. It's not about them. I've had a colleague who said, well, I can't teach that because I'm not Black. I can't do that because there's a lot of fear there. Let the artist speak for you and then ask questions. Just start there, right? Just let the artist speak. There's so many resources out there. So yeah, I guess that's all I have to add.
Well, as you mentioned, it's a lifetime of work. It's a practice. It never ends. There's no rainbow at the end of the work, right? That signifies that we're done. And with that, this is one talk, one drop in a lifetime of conversations that I hope people have. I think you mentioned, Gloria, that this is really a course, right? This is we're all just scratching the surface of a lot of this. It's already 6 o'clock, but we do have some questions in the chat if you two can stick around for some of them. I know we won't get, I apologize to everyone that we probably won't get to all of them, but any of the questions, comments, I will share with both of our speakers after our talk as well. So I'm just kind of going through and pulling some of them a little bit at random. I was trying to read through as they came in. Anton Russell, hi Anton, is another educator here in Tucson, fantastic art educator. He wrote, I appreciate y'all for your contribution, your care, and for all of us in this year. I am experiencing along with you the struggle to separate the very challenges for BIPOC in the American realm of oppression. To be more precise, we must humanize the struggles of those European ancestors before many are willing to sometimes be able to see us. My question is, will you speak to the harm waiting for those who refuse to take responsibility for the privileges they receive in this system y'all are speaking to? Are white folks hurting themselves by leaving the fight to BIPOC to liberate us? Really important question. I'm not sure which one of you wants to take that.
First, can I just say, I love the y'all part. I love that you have just spelled that out. Thank you for that. And yeah, I will say that it's almost like a person denying that something in their own past doesn't exist. There's a whole industry of therapists waiting for us humans to come and visit them to unpack all the stuff that we bring to us. I'm not sure where I heard it from, but I believe by the age of 3, we have all been traumatized in some way. We cry as humans, you know, whether we've fallen down and, you know, the adults in the room let us, you know, self-soothe. We come to trauma in different moments in our life. And I would say that not unpacking what it is that the system that we live in is a form of trauma. It is a form of denying that which exists. And so it then prevents us from not just connecting with other people, but even connecting with ourselves. And so when we think about the fact that we've lived through a pandemic for the better part of a year, and you know, most of us have gained weight, not lost weight. I call it eating my feelings. And so, you know, we cope with things in ways every single day. We cope with things that affect us. And so if you are a person who has been identified as white or who identifies as white, and these were not conversations that you had at the dinner table like many people of color have, then that is a form of denial. Someone has denied you the knowledge to understand how other people can't deny, can't ignore because of their everyday lived experience. And so I would say, yes, let's see, let me make sure that I'm answering the question, Anton. Are white folks hurting themselves by leaving the fight? Yes, I think so. It's, you know, sometimes in my classroom, you know, white students will speak up and say, we have to talk to one another. When we think about visual culture, our bodies are part of that visualization. And the way that people have been represented across time. So images of, you know, Black people at the turn of the 20th century that have been made into caricatures, that gets embedded in the psyche, so much so that we begin to project those beliefs, you know, onto the actual human beings that we're surrounded by. And so if we're living with those biases, then we need a space to have those conversations on how to reimagine otherwise. You know, so when we talk about creativity, I think that's a form of creativity. I mean, you've got to let your imagination imagine something different, imagine a different existence. And so I do absolutely, think that by not, first reflecting on, again, it goes back to the knowledge, like, where are we getting our knowledge from? What images have we ingested and digested, and what images are we living with that have affected our biases and what we come to believe about the world, and not just about one another as human beings in the material world, but how these things are getting represented and reproduced and reinscribed through a curriculum, whether it's informal or formal. And so, as my white students would say, y'all, we got to talk to each other. I mean, we, Black people, brown people have been saying this for a long time. And so we cannot, they're already saddled with, watching this gratuitous violence happen over and over. Last summer, it was ongoing, the murders ongoing. And then now it's turned into, anti-Asian sentiment. And so, there are certain human beings that just naturally carry this burden. And so at some point, and I think, it happens in moments. We've been able to see, just even, I can't think of the Republican representative, who has recently been ousted from her position of leadership, who is speaking out against these mythic notions of a stolen election. That takes some courage to kind of go against the grain and not get sucked into this, this big machine of power, right? Because it turns into ego. I generally go to, the base of human experience and go to the ego. Like, what is it that we're afraid we're going to lose if we just kind of become vulnerable and go with that second brain that we have in our belly when we know that something is not right and we don't speak up about it,
Yeah, beautiful. The question of like, what are you getting out of this?
Yeah.
And imagine what you could get if you, just start to imagine another path, another future. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why I think art is such a critical part of this conversation, right? The ability to create, who's creating, who has the power to create, and how are we encouraging those to imagine something different, right? Yeah, fantastic. So another comment question from Lex Drasic, another artist in town. Lex, hi Lex. Lex said, I really like what Liz said initially about only exposing students to the Western canon perpetuates quote unquote smallness, and exposure to contemporary art grows their world. Do either of the speakers think this limited exposure to art is intentional to keep students' worldviews small and limited? Interesting question.
Yes. Hi, Lex. Yes, it is. It is. I think some entities are conscious of it and some are unconscious because it is ingrained, right? So that's, we already know about this hierarchy of art, right? There's a reason why what happened in the Harlem Renaissance is not known, right? There's a reason why we don't really talk about the revolutionary aspect of Frida Kahlo, but we do talk a lot about her eyebrows, right? There's a reason for that. And what it comes down to is power structures, right? And think about any story of domination that you hear from the Nazis to whatever, right? Burning books, taking art and putting it, either pilfering it or like locking it away. Think about the purpose of propaganda art, right? And how that came about. It is absolutely intentional that the arts are underfunded. It's intentional that this idea of what art education is supposed to look like, which is based off the Westernized canon, exists, right? If you give young people power, what happens, right? We saw Parkland. We saw what happens when youth are empowered, when they are given a voice. And this idea of smallness, right? This idea of control. And also it's important to ask your students why you don't know about this, right? Because it does come down to empowerment and power structures and those sort of things. And we might be passively involved in this as our educators or educators in general, right? Why do we still teach the Iliad? It's a dope story, I get it. Who is it serving? Or is it serving this like monolith of to classical literature, right? It does nothing for my students, I can tell you that. They won't remember it unless they're super into like the Iliad and the Odyssey and Antigone and all those things, right? So that's a couple of kids out of how many kids you see in a day, right? But the students that read The Hate You Give this year couldn't stop talking about it in my classroom, right? And that is students of color and white kids. They were all talking about it, right? And they were making art about it too. And they did portraits of Angie Thomas. You know, they did all of these things. When you give kids power and you go outside of that small, because it is small. Think about Western European art and that canon, where it comes from, just in geography. It's small. There was so much stuff happening, right? And the stuff outside of that is considered artifact, right? It's not art. So this smallness, think about, smallness is a great word. I'm giving myself credit here. Thanks, Lex. But it is a great word because if you think of like all aspects of your life, if you keep small, you're going to be more comfortable, right? But you're going to miss out. And if you don't expand your understanding of others, your understanding of art, of the world, then we have situations like we did in January when people storming the Capitol. Like there are real ramifications to not adopting a larger worldview and teaching a larger worldview. So I do think it's intentional. I see it. I think sometimes it's even intentional because people are scared to move out of that realm. But you have to take up space in everything, and you definitely need to empower yourself and your students, right? Teenagers are very scary for adults. I learned at a young age, and I still see it, you know. But even elementary school kids, you can teach contemporary art to elementary school kids, and it definitely changes their understanding of things. Trust, it does. It just does. And it validates them, right? Because a lot of what they're doing as children is investigation, is research, right? They're trying to figure things out. This is what artists do as adults in the art world. So yeah, I think you're right there. I think you're onto something. I think of like body politics, right? Men and women, especially women like myself who take up a lot of space, can be seen as a threat, can be seen as against the norm, especially if that person is heavy or super tall or large in size and in personality, right? If they take up that space, it is a threat because it's pushing up against everybody else's. We just need to embrace the spaces. I don't know what I'm doing right now, but yes.
Elementary students love Nick Cave's work. They love
Oh my God. Nick Cave is amazing.
And if you've not ever seen one of his performances live, it will give you chills. It's so thoughtful and so beautiful, and children understand. They do. I think that if we, when I think about the notion of decolonizing curriculum and things like that, I also have to ask the question of how much we can do the actual work of decolonization when we have all been, if we grew up here in the US, if we were born here, that we were a part of a system that was influenced by those strategies. And so, you know, a scholar in art education, Dipti Desai, if you don't know her work, look her up because she is a powerhouse. And I had a conversation with her at a symposium, you know, where she answered, you know, a question of, you know, how is it that we decolonize our practice? And Dr. Desai said that I believe that the best that we can do is offer a decolonial gestures toward decolonial practice, because we have to also remember that we were educated within a system that was influenced by those strategies. So if we're thinking standardization, if we're thinking about removals of people from their land and insisting them into boarding schools to both leave behind, you know, and strip away parts of their ways of being and ways of knowing to a standardization, a standard form of speaking, a standard form of being, that there is the beginning of how we come to be who we are. And so when we think about, you know, ourselves as teachers who enter a space of not knowing where to start, it's because we were educated in the very system that we are now trying to interrupt. And so again, there is no shame in not knowing and admitting that I do not know where to start and I do not know where to enter into this conversation. And like Liz said, there are so many resources out there. And one of the ways is just to actually start to listen. I think Tim Wise, who is a person who speaks widely about race and racism, and he will say that all of his knowledge comes from Black and brown people. Like they are not his original ideas, and he will always give credit to those populations who have been speaking this truth for generations. And so that's another part of this praxis that we have to think about. Where are we getting our ideas from, and whose ideas have we not privileged and made important? Because Black and brown people have been saying this, as I said before, for generations. And so this also speaks back to, you know, how are you receiving your students into your classroom? What knowledges are you allowing them to share? And what are you also then giving credit for when we talk about, you know, citational practice in articles that we write, you know, or when I'm watching a lot of TikTok videos lately, y'all. I am hooked on TikTok. I mean, I watched my first TikTok video last week, so this has become a problem. But they are great and they're hilarious. But there are lots of people doing really cool things on TikTok, and they're giving credit to the original creators of a dance, for instance. You know, they're tagging Black and brown people, you know, who are the creators and producers. Like the body, you know, holds knowledge as well, and movement is part of that knowledge. And so the way we move our body and the way that we're free to move our body, you have to think about, you know, what are these movements that I'm appropriating and not giving credit to the original source from which I'm pulling from, you know, and that's a totally different conversation there, but it's all a part of this root structure that, you know, the foundation of anything is built upon. You know, what's happening at the root, and we know that the roots are rotten, ain't nothing growing.
Yeah. Yeah, I have nothing to follow that up because it was all just said so well. I know it's just such a fantastic conversation, and we've like totally blown past our time, but it's just so much really important, critical, insightful, and inspiring information. And there's still so many people with us, which I think speaks a lot to how valuable and meaningful it is. So I think there's a lot of questions that I think, you know, obviously haven't got to. And so I want to maybe bring it back to you, Gloria, is an initiative that you are part of here at the College of Fine Arts that some that are still interested in this topic maybe could find some way to become involved or get access to. Can you share with us a little bit about the Racial Justice Studio that is starting here at the College of Fine Arts at U of A?
Sure, absolutely. Am I, okay, I didn't know if I was muted. I'm often muted. So Chelsea is being very humble right now. And so Chelsea was actually the person who got this conversation started the end of last spring, I think, and right at the beginning of the pandemic and right at the height of what we were able to witness as the horrific, I think now 9 minutes and 29 seconds of watching someone's breath expire, for all of the public to see. And so Chelsea, who is deeply committed to community engagement and programming, who is deeply committed to social practice in and through art, had a conversation with Dr. Amy Cray, who is a colleague of ours in art and visual culture education here in the School of Art. And Amy then had a conversation with me, who, was familiar with the work that I was doing. And so we are the three-headed thing that makes Racial Justice Studio go. And so Racial Justice Studio arose out of conversations that wanted to engage with the very real ongoing violences and traumas that we were witnessing happening, last summer. And so Racial Justice Studio is an arts-centered, research-driven initiative that is supported by Arizona Arts. It's supported by Dean Andy Schulz, who has supported us with not only his words, but also with funding to make this thing, our ideas go. And we have 3 strands of programming that all enter into the conversation of racial justice at different points. Remember how I said we can come into this conversation at any point in the continuum and at our level of consciousness. And so those 3 streams of programming are Race Remix, which is an interdisciplinary dialogue between a person who is embedded in the arts and who has been doing work around racial justice or anti-racism, and also someone from another discipline. It could be public health, it could be Africana studies, and we bring those 2 people together to have a conversation about their work, about the contemporary moment, and those conversations are open to the public. And so we are working to have our first in the series begin this fall. Chelsea has been spearheading that. We also have a new course, Rehearsals in Anti-Racism. If I had the flyer to share with you all, I would do that. I have it somewhere here, but it is a course that is offered at the CFA level. It has a fine arts prefix, and it's open to students across the university. And we're hoping, to also, make the arts central, which is why we have named it Racial Justice Studio. And so that's Rehearsals in Anti-Racism. And then finally, we have the CAT network, which is the Creative Abolitionist Teaching Network. And Liz is one of our advisors who is helping us, think through what that means to open up a space for the K-12 teachers who are invested in this work of justice and equity into that conversation. And so we were starting with the visual arts, and we're spreading out across the fine arts. And we're hoping that teachers, even outside of those disciplines, can join us in this work, in this conversation. And so I hope that you all will stay in touch with us. Feel free to reach out to any of us if you have questions, or if you know people that are doing this work that we may not know. I believe that there are lots of people in this community who are doing the work and who are looking for the people that are doing the work. And so we now have this hub, you know, that we can support this work through, and we can do this through the support of the institution, which is how you know that real transformation can happen, when you have support from, you know, a structure that is willing to, be that the wind beneath to make it go.
It all comes back to performance art, right?
Yeah.
All teaching comes back to performance art.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for sharing that, as I think obviously with what we're seeing from the comments and just those that are willing to stick around for this conversation, that this is something that is of interest and is needed in not just in our local, Tucson, Arizona community, but nationally as well, as people are joining in from all over the country. So I'm really excited to see what maybe people share with us as well, and continue to move this forward with Racial Justice Studio. And I've been honored to work with you both and have you both contribute to the development of that. Well, I think I just want to close us out with a couple of thoughts, and maybe if I frame it as homework assignments for our educators in the room, is to keep thinking about that question of how do you let your students show up in the room? If you don't work with students, maybe it's your coworkers, your own children, those you interact with on a day-to-day basis. How are you letting them show up in the room? I think is a really, really critical I think it's just a really critical question. And another question that I think that you each kind of, pulled at that thread is, as educators, question, why am I teaching this? Who told me to teach this? And who is it serving, right? I think those are good questions that you've each brought up, and I think are nice homework assignments for us each to take home. So thank you, Gloria, Dr. Wilson, thank you so much for being here, sharing your wisdom, your expertise, your personal experience. Elizabeth Denneau, thank you for the same just absolute brilliance you've shared with us today. And I can't thank you enough.
Thank you, everybody, for coming and doing the work. Yeah,
Absolutely.
we're going to make a better world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, glad to share this space with all of you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both. And just a quick reminder, I'll be sharing a survey with folks. So look for that in your email, whatever email you use to register with. And we'd love to hear any feedback that you have. And I think Elizabeth put her email in the chat as well if you want to continue a conversation and ask questions. So thank you all so much for being here. Really appreciate you even sticking around for a longer conversation than we planned, but it was fantastic.